Just going to give you a little further clarification about the different types of hearing loss as they're represented on the audiogram. In the previous unit, we talked about 3 different types of hearing loss. We talked about conductive loss, where we have external ear, middle ear affected. We talked about sensory neural loss, where we have damage to the the inner ear and beyond. And then finally we have mixed hearing loss, where a person presents with a sensory neural hearing loss, and then on top of that, a conductive loss. Well, how are those 3 different types of loss demonstrated on the audiogram? Okay. First, we're going to look at conductive hearing loss. Conductive hearing loss shows on the audiogram via an air bone gap. Okay? The air bone gap shows the conductive loss at each frequency. So what do I mean by air bone gap? Well, we know that air conduction is shown on the audiogram with X's and O's, and we know that bone conduction is shown on the audiogram with these brackets, okay, or the carets if we're not using masking. So here we were using masking. But if there's a gap between the bone line and the air line, there is a conductive loss. Usually conductive loss is temporary. It could be permanent, but typically it's temporary. So for example, here we're showing that bone conduction is within the normal range. Your bone conduction line is within the normal range. Okay? The air conduction line, however, is down here in the hearing loss range. Okay? So when we did air conduction threshold testing, we showed damage. When we did bone conduction threshold testing, we showed no damage. Okay, so there is a conductive loss because the sensory neural pathway is in the normal range. However, the conductive pathway is not. Okay? Now, if the individual had a sensory neural loss only, we would see it represented on an audiogram like this, where your air lines, the X's and the O's, are similar to your bone lines, your greater than and less than signs here. Okay? Sensory neural loss on an audiogram is demonstrated by air conduction threshold and bone conduction thresholds matching. Okay? They are the same, they're symmetrical. Okay? There's no air bone gap, so there's no conductive loss. Okay? And we're not in the normal range, so there's a loss, and that loss is demonstrated by matching bone conduction and air conduction, so it's sensory neural in type. Our third type of hearing loss that we've discussed is a mixed hearing loss. Mixed hearing loss suggests that there's a sensory neural loss, and on top of that, a conductive loss. So in order for there to be a sensory neural loss, your bone conduction line has to be in the disordered range, and your air conduction line has to be in the disordered range. Okay? So nothing is in the normal range. However, the air conduction is worse than the bone conduction, and so there is an air bone gap. Okay? Here we see our bone conduction line. Your bracket's up here. It's in the disordered range. And then we see our air conduction line is below that. The threshold is not as low. Okay, so there is an air bone gap. Now, how much of the hearing loss is sensory neural? How much of the hearing loss is conductive in nature? So sensory neural typically being long-term, and conductive loss typically being only acute. Okay, well, the sensory neural loss is represented by the bone conduction line. That's this. Okay, that is permanent. Okay, the sensory neural loss is represented by the bone conduction line here. The portion that is conductive is represented by the air bone gap. So at 1,000 hertz, we have about 10, 20, 30 decibel conductive loss that is hopefully temporary. Okay? If we get this person on antibiotics or do a laryngotomy, then hopefully we can raise this line so that it matches the bone conduction line. And we get rid of that conductive loss, and then we only are left with a sensory neural loss. Okay, so total hearing loss is represented here. Okay, that's what the person is functioning like, because that's their air conduction threshold. But there is a bone conduction or sensory neural loss that is technically better than the total loss. So hopefully if we get rid of this conductive loss, we can get this person back to the sensory neural portion only.